I would like to welcome all of you to our first Friends of Fondren Library reception for Rice authors, editors, composers, and artists in several years now. Since we've had them, of course, by Zoom, but now we're actually in person. And one of the rules is just like in my classes: you take the people in the room, you multiply by 3, and you get the real number. Right? That's the way it works. So. Very seriously, we had a good number of people sign up, and this is actually what the turnout tends to be. We are filming this tonight, and if the sound quality is good enough, we'll make it available for the people who, for whatever reason, didn't come. And another thing we know is a lot of people at the last minute say, I'm not sure I'm going to risk it, so completely sympathetic. In any case, on behalf of the Friends of Fondren Library, thank you for joining us. And I am Caldwell, I'm Professor of History. My co-chair for the event tonight is Professor Jacqueline Couti, who is in French studies, but whose teaching and research extends from children's literature to the history of race and difference in Vichy France to the study of women and gender. So together we would like to welcome the participants tonight and, of course, all of you. I do want to remind you that it's Rice's policy that guests wear masks on campus unless they're eating or drinking. So I appreciate your understanding for that policy, which has worked actually very well during our time with COVID, which is coming to an end. I get to announce tomorrow. That's a joke. Tonight we're going to honor those members of the Rice community who have contributed published works to the arts, to the sciences, and to the humanities in 2021. After recognizing each honoree, we will introduce our panelists for the evening, and Julie Fette will moderate a discussion of our theme for the evening. We are very proud of the title, Family Curators, Critics of Patriarchal Imperialism, and Green Superheroes. Right? It pulls everything together you might need, writing about women across the disciplines from 3 very different kinds of perspectives. We're going to then open the floor to questions and answers from the audience, although I'm going to try to wrap it all up by about 7 because we do have refreshments. So we'll now turn to recognizing our honorees. I think I'm not going to ask anyone to stand because we don't have enough people here, but we do have a pretty astounding list of people. Let's see, Mary, are these going to be loaded up as we move forward here? You're in charge? Okay. Yeah, let's just start right here. David Abraham, promoting the Sustainable Development Goals in North American cities, case studies and their practices in the science of sustainability indicators. Jonathan Alco Franklin, with Yingping Li and Martin Kornbach, distributed acoustic sensing and geophysics methods and applications. Frank Allen, graduated in 74, Innocence Lost, Innocence Restored. Frank Allen, again, with Kathleen Allen Weber, 73, Changing Minds, Restoration, it's book 3 of a trilogy. Our colleague Graham Bader, Poisoned Abstraction, Kurt Schwitter's Between Revolution and Exile. Andrea Weisgaro, Experimenting with Ethnography, a Companion to Analysis. Rodrigo Barnes, 73, The Bouncing Football, Life Lessons on the Gridiron. What I really love about this list is that we're bouncing from one thing to the next. This really shows the variety of stuff that's coming out of this community here. Patricia Wynne Barnes-Ricks, Acts of Faith, and that's book 5 of the Blue Satan Mystery Series. Jim Bernard, Words Over Easy, Down the Apostrophes, Full Speed Ahead. Pretty clear. Jim Blackburn, with Isabel Spurry Chapman, Earth Church. Natasha Bowden, Wild-Eyed, which was an exhibition but also came out as a catalog, so we're talking about it in the context actually of book publications. New colleague in history, Luis Campos, with Michael Dietrich, Thiago Saraiva, and Christian Young, Nature Remade, Engineering Life Envisioning Worlds. Julia Giannoli, well that was terrible, Giannoli, I feel like the president reading.
Giannoloni.
Thank you. Connor, The Baby with 3 Families, 2 Countries, 1 Promise, International Adoption Story. Thank you very much. David Cook, Ibn Nassif's World History. Jacqueline Couti, in front of us. Sex, Sea, and Self. Nationalism and Sexuality in French Caribbean Discourse, 1924 to 1948. April DeConnick with Jeff Kreipel, Gnostic Afterlives in American Religion and Culture. Stephen DeLay, In the Spirit of Phenomenology of Faith. Elaine Uckland with David Johnson, Varieties of Atheism in Science. President Fette, Julie Fette, Le Français, a new book. Actually, it's an old book that's been redone. I've actually been enjoying reading it and learning to read French again here and there. So I had to say something because she has to, we can't really thank her because she's over here doing work for us tonight. Toby Blanchard, Paper Airplanes, a novel, writing as talented point. Christine Galib, Parables from the Pandemic, Holding on to Hope in a Hurrying World. Grapa Josenhans, Artists and the Rothko Chapel, 50 Years of Inspiration. Our second speaker, Rachel Kimbrough, Dean Rachel Kimbrough, In Too Deep, Class and Mothering in a Flooded Community. Rene Knudsen with Kimberly Davenport, Nanya Grenader, Carlos Jimenez, and Joshua Fisher, One Thing Well, 22 Years of Installation Art. Uriah Kriegel, Oxford Studies in Philosophy of Mind, Volume 1. Alexis Glynn-Latner, Star Maze. Kathy Mack, with Sharon Roche-Aliud, Judging and Emotion, a Socio-Legal Analysis. Tomas Morin, Machete, Poems. Timothy Morton, Spacecraft. Timothy Morton with Dominic Boyer, Hyposubjects on Becoming Human. Brian Ogren, Kabbalah and the Founding of America, the Early Influence of Jewish Thought in the New World. William Parsons, Freud and Religion, Advancing the Dialogue. Anthony Penn, Interplay of Things, Religion, Art, and Presence Together. And again, Anthony Penn, The Oxford Handbook of Humanism. Sonia Yang, Language and Truth in North Korea. And we have 5 by Eduardo Salas in psychology, fields of practice and applied solutions within distributed team cognition, foundations and theoretical perspectives of distributed team cognition, models, methodologies, and measures of distributed team cognition. Change the topic a bit. Psychology and human performance in space programs, research at the frontier, and finally, teams that work, the 7 drivers of team. Elora Shahabud, Sisters in the Mirror, A History of Muslim Women and the Global Politics of Feminism. George Schur, A Wild West of the Mind. Robin Sickles with Christopher Prometer, Advances in Efficiency and Productivity Analysis. John Spergana with Rachel Geiser and David Grubbs, Projectile. Our third speaker tonight, Christopher Sporangio, Comics Making, Person, Woman, Man, Camera, Monster, and the book we're talking about tonight, Greenie Josephini. Marina Benucci with Mullet Tades, Handbook of Bayesian Variable Selection. Jeff Winningham, A Trail of Marbles. Faye Yarbrough, Choctaw Confederates, the American Civil War in Indian Country. George Sodro with John Diamond, Prospects for American Growth in the United States. Also have an audiobook. John Marsh narrating The Magic Mountains by Alexis Glynn-Latner. And a number of editors here tonight. Leslie Marie Aguilar, Managing Editor of Studies in English Literature. Logan Browning, I'm doing the right order, Elizabeth Brake, Journal of Applied Philosophy. Logan Browning, again, Studies in English Literature. Joseph Campana, Studies in English Literature, is the editor. Patricia Lucia, Human Factors. Alexander Regier, again, Studies in English Literature, editor for 1660 to 1900. And last, Marina Benucci, co-editor of the Journal of the American Statistical Association. That's a huge amount of work and very important, I think, for the Academy and for the Academy in a broader sense of the word. I want to mention one art show, although I'm afraid we don't have all the art shows listed that we should for this past year. Sometimes it's hard to gather all the information. Joseph Tolbane Watercolor Art by Joe. And last but not least, I want to talk about composers of major musical works. Blench has published a recording of Sonata in D for violin and piano. He also was the arranger and orchestrator of Dan Brown's Wild Symphonies, Sonata in D. Anthony Brandt, Live Wire for String Quartet, Block Party for block cellist and three-seated cellist, and Concert for String Orchestra. Arthur Gottschalk, Sonata for violin and piano, also Upon Whose Shoulders We Stand, recorded with the Shepherd Symphony Orchestra. Pierre Jambert, All Is Now, also String Theory, CD recording, and Sweet and Doleful Timbers. I'm really out of breath now. This is so great to read these things. One of the reasons I agreed to do this event is because I'm so impressed by what comes out of this community, as I said. To all of our honorees this evening, the Friends of Fondren Library, we would like to extend our congratulations and our thanks for your significant contributions. Now I think it's time for us to move on to the panel discussion. And so I yield the floor to my colleague, Julie Fette, who will moderate the discussion.
Thank you, Carl. I think you can hear me. As I interview our distinguished panelists, Jacqueline Couti, Rachel Kimbrough, and Christopher Sporangio, I want to invite you to meditate on the title of this session, the fantastical session of this panel, a fantastical title of this panel discussion. I'll repeat it because I think it's so fantastic. Because Carl came up with it. Family curators, critics of patriarchal imperialism, and green superheroes, writing about women across the disciplines. So, I'd first like to introduce Rachel Kimbrough. I'll introduce each speaker before I ask them an initial question. Rachel is a professor of sociology and now our dean of social sciences. I'm very proud of her. Her research focuses on major questions of inequality, family, and health. She has published on topics as diverse as neighborhood diversity, social behavior, food insecurity, health habits, air quality. She is affiliated with many grant institutions around Texas and beyond, notably the Texas Children's Hospital, the Baker Institute here at Rice, the Kinder Institute of Urban Research here at Rice, and Baylor College of Medicine. Rachel has won many grants and fellowships, most notably a 2020 Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant that she is leading now on low-income families and nutrition. And in 2022, she published the book In Too Deep with University of California Press. Rachel, women do play a starring role in the stories you tell in Too Deep. The women you studied, women in a particular Houston neighborhood that went underwater no less than 3 times in 3 years. It was the Memorial Day flood of 2015, the Tax Day flood of 2016, many in the room will remember, and Hurricane Harvey in 2017. These women, you argue in the book, are on the front lines of climate change. And one particular quote from Rachel's book struck me after you recount a harrowing story of one woman's experience with flooding in Houston, and I'll quote it. Rebecca's story may seem like an outlier, but the world is full of Rebeccas, and more are in the making as climate change intensifies flooding events. So Rachel, I want to ask you about your conclusions about gender from your research. What is it about women's place in the family and in the neighborhood that puts them at the front lines of climate change?
Well, thank you, Julie. I'm really happy to be here tonight. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to talk a little bit about my book. So I interviewed 36 mothers in, as Julie said, a Houston neighborhood that flooded 3 times in 3 years, the last time in Hurricane Harvey. And I wanted to talk to them about their experiences of the flood and their experiences of flood recovery. So I actually spoke to them twice, once just after the hurricane hit and then again a year later. And I really found that if I had not followed up a year later, I would have missed a whole lot about their experience after the flood. Because in the initial adrenaline rush of the flood and the aftermath, everybody was pulling together and families were functioning well. But over the course of the year, as they worked on their recovery, the division of labor inside the household became very fractured. So the mothers were taking on the vast majority of the recovery work, and they became understandably irritated about that. And that caused a lot of issues for them, including marital conflict and even health issues, mental and physical issues that they were dealing with. And at the same time, they were trying to protect their children to kind of help their children, some of whom were traumatized, recover from the flood experience, as well as kind of combat their daily anxieties whenever it rained in Houston. At the same time, the neighborhood school was also destroyed, and so the mothers in particular were trying to mitigate that issue for the kids as well. So I think in this story, the mothers were the people who selected the neighborhood in the first place as a place to live and raise their children. And that's something that a lot of sociological work shows. Mothers generally are driving the decisions about where to live. And then they also drove the decision about what to do after the flood. And so in my book, most of them, 28 out of 36, decided to stay in this neighborhood, even though it had such flood risk. And it was because they saw themselves as the person who had selected the place as a place to raise their kids, and they felt very passionately about staying, and they felt passionately about the leadership that they had shown in their community during the recovery process.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. I'll come back to you with another question. My second panelist is right next to me, Jacqueline Couti. I'd like to introduce her a little bit before I ask her a first question. She is the Laurence Favrot Professor of French and Francophone Studies here at Rice. She's a specialist of Francophone Caribbean Studies with expertise ranging across New World Studies, Comp Lit, the Atlantic World, Gender and Women's Studies, Post-Colonial Theory, and Performance Studies. Her research agenda is generally focused on colonial representations of bodies and how they are appropriated and perverted in post-colonial eras. Her first monograph was called Dangerous Creole Liaisons, in which she argues that a neglected body of conservative and nostalgic literature of 19th century white writers still haunts French popular views of race and gender. Her second monograph that we're celebrating today is called Sea, Sex, and Self, 2021, Liverpool University Press, is a sequel of sorts and a 20th century response to the first book. This study looks at how female and male Antillean authors of color responded to the French colonialist mythologies that exoticized and sexualized Creole women. Jacqueline focuses on Martinique and Guadeloupe, French administrative territories with very complicated post-colonial presence. So a question for you, Jacqueline, about women. Black women of the French Antilles do play a starring role in the stories you tell in Sex, Sea, and Self. The writers you focus on, Suzanne Lacascade, the Nardal sisters, and Mayotte Capecia, all attempt in their writing to reclaim their voice and their agency against a narrative tradition dominated by white and even sometimes black males that have racialized and sexualized them. So I want to ask you, in your view, do these women succeed?
So thank you, Julie, for this question. So that's a easy and difficult question at the same time. These women write, and they do publish, and they do talk about themselves. So in that way, we think they're successful. And I want also to know that for me, sometimes talking about oneself is the most way to free yourself. It's, for me, an expression of freedom, even if you simply talk about how hard it is to be a woman. And these women I'm examining, this is what they're talking about. Literally, they're saying it's just hard to be a woman in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and it's hard to be a black woman. So for some people nowadays, they're like, hey, whatever. But at that time, when you're writing to express your hope for a better future in a space that's not listening to you, that's a success. Then the problem comes, for me, who is talking about them anymore? Who is examining them? Who is studying them? So they're being forgotten. So then suddenly we realize, well, maybe what they have to say was not so successful because no one is trying to discover what they have to offer. Then the question for me is not so much is their writings a success, but how are we failing the people who have been writing about themselves, who have been trying to present us different words, how are we making space for them to touch us? So I will welcome you and invite you to discover what those women have to say. Because no matter what, even if they are coming from the Caribbean, they are still talking about the human existence. And when you think and you start, as you said, this idea of what a woman in everyday instances, how difficult it is, and how you're going to try to find your way to survive or thrive, we all have something to learn about it. So yes, there's success because I'm here talking about them, but I think they will become more and more successful when people like you, the readers, are going to discover their story and keep their voice alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I will now introduce our next speaker before I ask him a question about women and gender. Chris, welcome. Christopher Sporangio is an associate professor of painting and drawing here at the Department of Visual and Dramatic Arts at Rice. He is not just a graphic novelist or a graphic artist, I wonder which one you tend to call yourself, but also works in other visual spaces such as television, internet, and in painted installations. He's had solo gallery shows and he's been featured in museums around Europe. Sporangio co-founded a media production company called Cartoon Kings, with a K. He's written 22 comic books with a partner, and Pinko Joe was Chris's first solo comic book, which follows the action of an anti-capitalist title character during a fictional third term of President Eisenhower. The political satire we are celebrating tonight is Chris's Greenie Josephini, published with Canadian publisher Argle Bargle in 2021. It is his latest trilogy, and it offers a delightful, sharp commentary on neoliberal capitalism and the threat of fascism. Sporangio in Greenie Josephini takes us into a futuristic world, 140 years from now, in which corporate capitalism has led to feudalism. In this 22nd century New World Order, oligarchy and slavery have replaced democracy and the nation-state system. Josephini, the title character, is a member of a genetically engineered race of photosynthetic humans who are actually considered inferior because they are green. Greenie meets and collaborates with a resuscitated Pinko Joe to overthrow the oligarch oppressors. And as they thrash through an apocalyptic future, the author spares no kind word for the death penalty, police impunity, racism, prison conditions, border separation of families, automation's effect on the labor force, the military's anti-gay discrimination, the misuse of big data, or polar ice cap meltdowns. So Chris, I do have a question for you about gender and women. The title character, Greenie Josephini, she doesn't have much of a role in chapter 1 of this trilogy. In the second chapter, she features really only in the first half until we go back to Pinko Joe. And in the third chapter, she shares the action with Pinko Joe. And I know that in this trilogy, you are doing something called culture jamming or pastiching. The French term is détournement, where you kind of hijack an old genre into something new. Chris will maybe tell us more about it later. He's working with 1950s comics of a true crime or a science fiction genre. And I ask you this about women, Chris. If you are doing this kind of hijacking of a previous genre from the 50s, is this as far as you can push the boundary to create a non-sexualized heroine subject without turning your graphic novel into something unrecognizable or unmoored? And if so, if this is as far as one can go, how else do you subvert sexism? Because I think you do. But in so many words, why did you invent this heroine?
So, I don't know, can you hear me? Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to jump over here to the slides and try to explain a little bit what my thinking was. So this is installation that I did at PS1 with a Museum of Modern Art, where we did an installation inside the gallery. So the comic book was an artwork in the museum, but you could also buy it. And it was a newspaper stand that I built that was staffed by people that worked at the museum. And I'm always trying to collide things. And so here I was trying to collide DC Comics, the home of Wonder Woman and Superman, with the Museum of Modern Art. Like, I really wanted to knock those two things together and see if something came out of that. And of course, nothing did. So I'm answering your question, but I'm just taking the long way around, because part of what I'm doing here at Rice is verging on scholarship. I'm not a scholar, and so I'm playing one. I think of comics the way I think of film, as a kind of communication technology, and it's actually a kind of shadow technology that grew up at the same time as film, and of course looked on as trash by our culture. Not the French though. The French love comics. It's big in France, it's big in Japan, it was big in Mexico. Yeah, so I sort of established this little space for not only making comics and thinking about making comics, but also other kinds of scholarship as well. The root of what I'm doing is based in a group called the Letterists, and the group that came after them, the Situationists, and they developed this process, this détournement, where they would take comic pages and they would rewrite them and redraw them to suit their political needs. This is an example from 1968. It's been translated into English in '74. But this is basically that détournement never went past like a page or a panel. Like, it was never this big complicated thing. And I decided that I would take that process and I would try to make a long form narrative out of it. And that's where we get Pinko Joe, Green Josephine, and Red, White, and You Blew It All to Hell is the next book, the final book. I did what I tell my students never to do, which is I tell them to start with a plan. I had no plan. I do as I say, not as I do. So I started this process of détournement using old comics to generate this new material. And I got to page 96 and I realized that it was so flawed. And the problem was, do I stop and take it apart and spend another year? I'd spent 4 years working on the first book. Do I take it apart or do I just carry on? And that's what I decided to do. I'll just carry on. I figured out how to do it after 96 pages. Well, that's not exactly true. And so you'll notice in the second book that Greedy, even though she's the titular character, she's still not the dominant. She's not taking up as much space as one hopes. The source material that I was working with was wildly sexist. 1950s, 1950, 1951, women in comics were either victims or trophies or just the object of terror. And it took a lot of digging and a lot of sort of, I'm Frankensteining this thing together. And so, I feel lucky to have gotten that far. I think by the end of the third volume, everything kind of evens out. But, I'm an idiot. Like, why work without a plan? And it led to a lot of improvisation. So other things that.
Well, one particular quote, I'll probably misquote it a little bit from a speech bubble, was, an evil enemy man captures Greenie Josephine and says, "It's a woman, let's underestimate her." Was one of my favorite lines. Now I'll go around the panel again and ask a different question about the research and the writing process to each of our panelists. Everyone is very thoughtful in these texts, and I do encourage you to get your hands on these books and have a read because they're all extremely compelling. But all of our authors here today in front of the room really are very conscious about their research and writing process and include discussions about that process in the actual text. And so, Rachel, I actually thought, this may sound silly, but one of the most interesting parts of your book was actually the appendix, where you explain your methodology, how you came to the project, your process, your positionality. So I'd like to know, what did you learn from doing this kind of sociology, which I think is a different kind of sociology than you're used to doing?
Yes, that's right. Most of my work has been quantitative work on child health and well-being, as well as neighborhood effects on families. And so those topics are definitely in the book. So topically, it's a similar thing, but this is an entirely qualitative project, working with in-depth interviews and then doing analysis of those interviews. So it's very, very different for me. It was a risky thing. It was a risk, a scholarly risk. But I kind of felt like I reached the point in my career where if I'm not going to take a risk now, when am I ever going to take it? Right? So I decided to take the leap. And I wrote most of the book during my year-long sabbatical a couple of years ago, which was a wonderful gift from Rice. And it was just a totally different style of working, but I really loved it. And I also did something very transgressive in the social sciences, which is I took a creative nonfiction class, which was amazing, and really helped me, hopefully anyway, bring some life to the stories that I was telling in the book. So yes, it was definitely a curveball for my career, but I'm really glad that I took the risk and tried it out.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll stick with you if you don't mind for a final question. Like many in this room, potentially, I lived through these 3 storms. You did.
I did not flood, but
I know, you lived through them.
Yes.
I think probably everyone in this room did. I did flood during Harvey, but I read the 2 chapters of the book dedicated to preparations for the storm and then living through the storm. I read those with my heart pumping, first with total dread and then with horror. So what for you was it like to interview the trauma survivors?
So when I first interviewed the women, it was within 8 weeks of Hurricane Harvey, and so the stories were really fresh. But they had not had a chance yet to tell anyone their stories because all of their friends in their neighborhood had flooded too. And so there really wasn't anyone for them to tell, or they would sometimes get reactions of, "Oh, well, so-and-so had it worse, don't you know?" So when they were talking to me, it was really their first chance to tell the story from beginning to end. And although this was not the point of what I was doing, a nice byproduct was that at the end of the interview, many of them thanked me for just listening to them and letting them tell the entire story, and that they felt it was sort of therapeutic for them to do it. But the opposite of that was true for me, because by the end of my process, I had 36 horrible, traumatic flood stories in my brain. And after each interview, I learned, thanks to some good advice from my colleagues in sociology, to take a walk after everyone and try to kind of process through what I had heard. But then the only thing that really helped me was when I started writing the stories down. So it was if I could kind of get them out of my mind. And then the second follow-up interview was differently traumatic because there was a lot of marital conflict that was going on. Women were very, they were also upset about that, and so that was differently traumatic. But in the end, I was really happy to get all the stories down into the book, And if it helps them in some way, then I think that's great.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Jacqueline, like Rachel, you are a very conscious scholar with complex ambitions as well. And in your case, you bring to the table forgotten or actually ignored 20th century Antillean authors. And at the same time, while you're bringing them to our attention, you're also helping your readers understand that these authors might not be or might not perform perfectly anti-racist or anti-sexist discourses. So that's a complicated agenda, and I wonder what this struggle was like for you as you structured and as you structured your book and as you wrote your book.
So let's say that it was painful. So I need to preface that I often tell my students that I'm cynical. I'm like, my vision of life is not always rosy. And I'm not into heroes. I'm not writing to simply praise people because I'm a very faulty person with a lot of, shortcomings, so I think everyone is like, maybe everyone is perfect. So the women I examine, I do not expect them to be perfect. So the work I was doing is giving them the space to just be human. And the space to be human is exactly that. Starting to develop an idea, which is great, and then you go into a patriarchy, and you're like, darn it. If you simply could concentrate on that. And I wanted to share also their struggle. And that's why the book is divided into she says and he says, because I still remember my grandparents already like fighting with each other. And when I asked them about the Second World War, both of them had a different view of the war and the consequences. My grandmother hated everything. For her, it was a period really challenging and horrible. My grandfather was a Navy officer, so he was chilling on his boat or whatever, so everything was perfect for him. So I always kept in mind this idea of lived experience. What does it mean that some women seems to try to attack a patriarchal system, but at the same time they're reinforcing also this system. So that's why I wanted to have two parts for us to understand what was happening at that period. So to really realize that what they were doing was, to their level, anti-sexist, not for us, because we're living in a world where if you marry with a man, you have rights. In France, until 1965, if you were married, you needed your husband to even open your bank account. So we have to keep this in mind to realize in the 90s, 20s, 1930s, these black women, so you have sexism and race, sometimes they were better at fighting racial discrimination than sexism. And all these ideas in my mind, I wanted to show the limits, but also the glory of their fights. In that sense that, I'm like, yeah, they're like perfect. And they're real fighters. They tried. And sometimes in life, just trying maybe the only thing we can do. So that's why I said it was traumatic, because each time I have to think, what do I want to say? Who is going to be my reader? And I wanted people not knowing the space, the history, the kind of emotional fabric to get what I wanted to say. So that's why maybe it's also more mature work, meaning that I wasn't just writing for me. I wanted to give those people a voice. And to give them a voice, I have to be very particular about letting them talk without judgment. I'm a very judgmental person. And when you are, eventually, you forget about judgment because you're like, hey, no one is perfect. So just let them be themselves. And I was asking also my readers, they're great, but they're not perfect. Let's just celebrate their humanity in that way. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Last question for you, Jacqueline. It's about your title. I always have to find the word. Sexy and Self. Sex, sea and self. We get the first and the last. What about the sea in the middle, literally in the middle? It is the setting of the transatlantic colonial and post-colonial encounters that you analyze. And I love this quote from you. You call the sea the great, silent, unacknowledged player in the relationship between France and the Antilles. So can you say more about the role of the sea, if you would, for the post-colonial diasporas that you analyze in your book?
Yeah, so first, I was inspired by Serge Gainsbourg's song. You know, we all have our classics in our minds. But at the same time, this idea of the sea, you know, when you're an islander, when you're born on the sea, your relationship to the land is different. It's the same like when you're coming from a small village. The space is going to frame the way you speak. And when you're coming from an island, from the Caribbean, when some of your ancestors were taken from Africa and dropped there, it makes everything more difficult. So the sea, when I was little, my grandmother never wanted us to go and swim because she was afraid that we'd die and drown. And I'm like, you know, I'm taking classes to swim, but she didn't want to hear any of that. We needed to be on the sand, not in the water. So there's a very difficult relationship with the sea. The sea is both a way that will help you to go out, but it's also a boundary. Because if you don't know how to swim, if you don't have a canoe or anything, you're stuck where you are. So that's why I was saying that all the discussion we may be having about how to construct your identity, the sea is at the bottom of that, literally. Because if you have the money at the time in the 1920s, 30s, you could take a boat, go to France, get your education. If you were poor, broke, you stayed there. What could travel were the ideas. And this is what I want to keep in mind also, that we are traveling ideas via books, via boats at the time. So in my book, I don't talk about the sea as a metaphor, because the sea is everywhere. The sea is not a metaphor, the sea is a way of life, and the way your mind is going to flow, and where like the sea. And I remember one of the evaluators of the book was like, yeah, but where's the sea? No, what do you mean where's the sea? The sea is in the book. The book is the sea. So that's why I put this there, because I was like, I'm not talking about the sea, because transatlantic relationship, at the time, you can only take a boat. And then you have the Atlantic and you have the Caribbean Sea. There's a lot of different seas in that space. So that's why you have, you know, so here you have a picture of Martinique and of the island, and you could see, well, it's not blue, but the sea is there. So the question is, how do you read the sea? And for me, like, you know, our body is made out of water, so my body is also made out of the sea. And in post-colonial studies, some of us may know, in an Anglophone setting, about this notion of Black Atlantics by Paul Gilroy. But some of my writers in the 30s, they were already talking about this idea of Black internationalism, where ideas will go back and forth between the Atlantic Sea. And you have someone like Edouard Glissant talking about Lausanne, the Indies, and making this beautiful theory about the sea and chaos. So the sea is the beginning and the end. This is how I use this discussion.
Thank you, Jacqueline. It's fantastic. Chris, like Jacqueline and like Rachel, you do not neglect to bring your research process into the stories you wrote. And while you may have already touched on that a little bit, I wonder if you could say more about a paradox that you mentioned midway in between chapters 2 and 3, because your research project both appropriates artistic creation from the past and denounces capitalism. And even you, I believe, you consider that a paradox. So can you tell us more about that paradox and what it's like for your process?
Well, I call the series the Forced Collaboration Trilogy, because I think that it's very menacing sound, forced collaboration. I'm working with dead people. They don't have any choice. in terms of a paradox, I had a teacher when I was in Chicago who said that there's no escaping the web of capitalism. Like, no one's getting out. But I don't really see these as commercial. I don't think they're going to be in a Netflix series anytime soon. If they are, track me down and mock me. But I'll be in Hollywood somewhere. Probably everyone else. Silver Lake is nice, right? I think that's I'm a little bit of a clown, and so I don't know if you gather that. But the way these books are made, so I'm taking old comics and I'm going through thousands and thousands of pages of them until I see, I made some rules for myself. So I wanted to take complete stories and then I wipe all the text, all the color, and then I start from a kind of skeletal level, and then re-add text, writing, and then re-inking and redrawing everything. Sometimes making changes if I need to, but trying not to make changes, and then adding color and creating this. So it's a Frankenstein's monster, and it walks and it talks, but the villagers are afraid of it. The villagers don't like it. It's kind of it's a little bit of a mess, but that's it's exciting too at the same time, because nobody's, probably rightfully so, nobody's ever done this in this particular way. It's I know now why nobody's done this. So the process really dominates the making of it. If you wanted to sit down and write a story, you just write the story and decide when things are going to happen. But with this stuff, because I'm using these old bones, I kind of have to surf everything. And like, maybe I want to go that way, but I have to go that way first, because that's where the current state is. So I think I managed it by the end, but I'll leave that up to the reader.
Well, thank you, Chris. One last question for you. I'm listening to you and I'm deciding that you may consider yourself more of a graphic novelist than a graphic artist. I'm not sure. But for a book that is so distinctly visual compared to the other books, most of the other books up on being honored tonight, your style actually revels in wordplay and in literary illusion. Your characters use figures of speech, etc., and they play on the use of figures of speech as well. So for you, I want to know, really, how much does text and illustration weigh?
Well, I think that text is a place where I have a little more control. I can kind of, if there's space for the words in a particular panel, then I can put those words in there. And I worked in television for a while, and the thing that they kept, I wrote and created television. I had a TV series that ran for a couple of seasons, and I was admonished, like, don't take jokes out, put jokes in. Like, you want to laugh on every page. People aren't laughing on every page. So these sort of puns or literary allusions, or one of my favorite things to do is to like make typos. Like, who does that? Like, oh, this is gonna be a typo. Like, that's it's stupid. But it also like I hope that it's clear to the reader that it's a typo. I try to do that. I'm backstopping basically by if the plot is too crazy at the moment with like talking carrots or in the final volume there's a tribe of talking gorillas that are Ayn Rand devotees. And so brandy and gorillas. If all of that's too confusing, then like some sort of dumb pun in the text lets me save myself. And so I'm really just basically covering my ass, like anywhere I can, like a sad magician.
On that note, I knew I couldn't get you to pick between being a graphic novelist or a graphic artist, but I will thank our panelists again, and I'll pass the parole back to Carl Caldwell. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.
I think I can do without, like, I at first thought they were typos. They were just too weird to be typos. It just, it's like, okay, this must be something intentional here. So this is really a panel on trying to take control under conditions of existential dread, right? Again and again, that's what's coming up. We have maybe 10 or 15 minutes. If anyone has a question to raise, probably time for 2 or 3 questions before we go to the reception. So I open the floor to the audience.
Chris, how do you deal with copyright on these images?
Are you a lawyer?
I only play them on TV.
Well, it's all material that's in the public domain. And so even so, a really credible publisher, not that Argo is incredible, it's small. A big publisher was interested until their lawyer saw it. And they said this is too fugitive. It's the public domain and fair use have been sort of bullied into a corner. And so literally, if you're making things that are based on other things, publishing companies run the other way.
The follow-up to that is, I've seen your work, and you're perfectly capable of doing your own. So, is it just because you're following the détournement, or?
Yeah. I mean, but the détournement is what drives me. I mean, I really I love that. I've got during the pandemic, cultural institutions are shut. Nobody's buying comic books. And so I started doing a daily post on Instagram and using the same method, but in a single panel. And that was a lifesaver for me. And it really has kind of taken over now. I get up, and by the time I've had my first cup of coffee, I make a piece. And again, it's pure theft. I mean, but stealing from dead people, so maybe I'll be okay. I don't know.
Any more questions from the audience? I think people are hungry. I want to hand it back to Julie for a second.
Okay, and Friends of Fondren Library would like to gift a very important gift, especially today, to each of our so in honor of the group, yes, a golf-sized rice umbrella can serve as a weapon. But I believe Mary said that umbrellas are actually the most checked out item of the library.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks again to what a great group of, this is so wonderful to actually have the opportunity to read them. One day, Rosa's book will be her hopefully to sell the books again, which was what we used to do back years ago. But in any case, one more time, let's thank them. And we owe a lot of thanks to Mary Lowry, who is simply a superb curator, as to quote Rachel, of the constant crisis that's Friends of Fondren under COVID. So thank you very much. Tonight's event was presented, of course, by Friends of Fondren Library. That is a membership organization that provides financial support to Rush University's Fondren Library and for the greater, and also presents lectures and events for our members and for the greater Houston community. I want to stress this been in operation for a long time, and they've done amazing things in our library. They actually step in where the university doesn't step in to provide better study spaces, to ensure this is the intellectual hub of the university. Even if our students don't go into the Saks anymore, they're using it in other ways. And so, I mean, it's a very important thing to have this group existing. If you aren't already a member, please consider this a personal invitation to join. And I say personal because for me, the library truly is the center of my academic work at Rice. So there will be membership forms, I believe, outside in the hall. I hope you will join us for for future Friends of Fondren events. Our next event will be outgoing Vice Provost for Research Yusuf Shamu, who will speak on the books that shaped my world on March 10th. These are usually amazing events. I didn't know that Yusuf, for example, is an avid reader of Stanislaw Lem, the Polish science fiction writer. Okay, so you learn things about people you had no idea about. Event information for this and other upcoming events, as well as membership applications, as I said, are available on the slide, but also on the Friends of Fondren website. So with that, thank you for coming. It's great to see you. Hey, we're back. Let's pretend like COVID's over.
For those of you who are used to coming to our events where we do a reception in the Lovett Lounge, we're going to ask you to walk just a little bit farther.